Wittgenstein's philosophy begins from a simple but brutal question. What can actually be said with meaning? He thought philosophy had become lost in pseudo-problems, confusions that arise when we misuse language, when we take words out of the context that gives them sense. To clear this up, he tried to map the limits of language itself. His early position, found in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, treats language as a kind of logical picture of the world. The idea is that every meaningful statement corresponds to a possible state of affairs. The grammar of a proposition mirrors the structure of reality. When you say, "the cup is on the table," that sentence has a form that lines up with the way objects could actually be arranged. If the world really contains a cup and a table, and the first sits on the second, the proposition is true. If not, it's false. Meaning is this possibility of being true or false. In this view, the world isn't a pile of things, but a totality of facts, ways that things are combined. Language is the network of propositions that can describe those facts. Logic is the skeleton that both share. It's not a property of the world or of language separately, but of their shared structure. Logic is what makes sense possible at all. So when we speak meaningfully, we are, in effect, projecting a logical form onto the world. This is why, for Wittgenstein, logical truths don't describe anything. They show the structure all description must already have. They are tautologies, saying nothing about the world, but revealing how any statement about the world must fit together. From here, Wittgenstein draws a sharp boundary. If a statement doesn't picture a possible state of affairs, it's nonsense. Traditional philosophical questions about ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, or the meaning of life do not fit this picture-structure model. They can't be true or false, so they can't be said meaningfully. Yet, he insists, they are not worthless. They show something about the limits of our thinking. The most important things, value, purpose, what gives life meaning, cannot be spoken but only shown. To live ethically is not to utter ethical propositions, but to live in a certain way. Thus the famous final proposition, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." The role of philosophy, then, is not to build theories, but to clarify what can and can't be said. Once that's done, philosophy's work is finished. After the Tractatus, Wittgenstein believed he had solved philosophy, but later he realized his picture theory was itself a trap. It assumed that all meaningful language works by picturing facts, but that isn't how we actually use language in everyday life. Most of the time, we aren't describing the world's structure. We're asking, promising, joking, praying, commanding, guessing. Words don't get their meaning by mirroring reality, but by being used within human activities. This is the turn of his later thought, developed in Philosophical Investigations. There he abandons the idea of a single underlying logic of language. Instead, he speaks of many language games. A word's meaning is its use within a form of life, a pattern of human behavior. Understanding a word isn't grasping some hidden definition, it's knowing how to use it appropriately in different contexts. This move destroys the hope of finding one essence that defines all language or meaning. There is no single structure tying every word together, just a family resemblance among different practices. Think of how the word game is used. Some games have rules and competition, like chess. Others, like playing catch, are freeform. There's no single feature common to all games, only overlapping similarities. The same goes for concepts like understanding, thinking, or knowledge. The philosopher's mistake is to assume there must be something common behind all uses, and then to search for it, creating artificial puzzles. Once we look at the actual use of words, the puzzles dissolve. For Wittgenstein, this changes what philosophy is supposed to do.
Philosophy no longer constructs theories about reality or meaning. It becomes an activity, a kind of therapy. Its task is to remind us of how our language actually functions so we stop being bewitched by misleading pictures. When a philosophical problem seems deep, what's really happening is that words are being taken out of the contexts that give them meaning. To resolve it, we don't need to discover new facts. We need to untangle the linguistic knots we've tied ourselves into.
This leads to one of his most famous points. There can be no such thing as a private language. Suppose you tried to invent a language that only you could understand, referring to your private sensations. Wittgenstein argues that wouldn't work, because the very idea of meaning depends on the possibility of public criteria. If you say S each time you feel a certain sensation, how do you know you're using S consistently? Without a public standard, there's no distinction between seeming right and being right. Language requires a shared space of agreement. That doesn't mean everyone must have the same experiences, only that the meaning of words is anchored in publicly accessible practices. From this follows a new way to look at mind and thought. Philosophers often treat mental events as inner objects or processes hidden behind behavior. Wittgenstein flips that. Talk about mind isn't a description of hidden things, but a set of rules for participation in certain forms of life. When we say someone understands, believes, or intends, we aren't reporting an inner observation. We're acknowledging patterns of action and response. To know what pain means isn't to introspect, but to know how to respond to someone's cry, to recognize the circumstances in which the word pain is used. Mind is not a secret realm inside us. It's expressed in what we do and say. This dissolves the traditional mind-body problem. The division between inner and outer is itself a grammatical one, not a metaphysical fact. Philosophers think they're studying consciousness, but they're really misusing words like see, feel, or know. Once we look closely at their ordinary use, the mystery evaporates. This approach is sometimes called ordinary language philosophy, but Wittgenstein himself would say it isn't a theory at all. It's a method of paying attention. He extends this attention to logic, mathematics, and certainty. In his later notes, especially on certainty, he explores the idea that even our most basic beliefs are grounded not in evidence, but in our practices. We don't believe the world has existed for many years because we've tested it. That belief is part of the framework that makes testing possible. Such fundamental certainties aren't knowledge or hypotheses. They're the bedrock of our language games. They form what he calls hinge propositions, points around which all questioning turns. This is another way he undermines the idea of a final logical foundation. There is always a background of unspoken agreement that allows reasoning to function. Ethics and aesthetics, which he earlier said cannot be spoken, reappear here not as hidden truths, but as patterns in our lives. Values show themselves in the kinds of life we lead, the ways we use language to express approval or disapproval. Philosophy cannot deliver moral knowledge. It can only clarify the forms through which moral life is lived. The unsayable isn't mystical. It's woven into how language meets the limits of human action. Wittgenstein's overall effect is radical. He doesn't replace old theories with new ones. He makes us see that we don't need theories in the first place. The urge to theorize is itself a symptom of misunderstanding how language works. Once we see that words get their sense from their use, we stop chasing essences and start observing. Philosophy becomes a description of our linguistic behavior rather than a construction of hidden realities. When Wittgenstein's later readers talk about the rule-following problem, they're picking up one of the hardest points in his philosophy. Every use of a word can be viewed as following a rule.
But how do we know that what we're doing really counts as following the same rule, rather than just something that seems similar? Suppose I add 2 to each number. 2, 4, 6, 8. And then someone asks what comes next. I say 10 because that's what the rule plus 2 demands. But any finite series of examples can fit an infinite number of possible rules. The symbols themselves don't force one continuation over another. What fixes meaning is not the rule as an abstract formula, but the way a community treats certain continuations as correct. To follow a rule is to act within a practice where certain moves are accepted and others aren't. This looks simple, but it destroys a whole tradition of thinking about meaning as something inner and private. It shows that understanding a rule is a social ability, not a mental act. You know how to go on because you've been trained, corrected, and integrated into shared ways of doing things. The same holds for grammar and logic. The sense of necessity in logical rules doesn't come from some metaphysical realm, but from the firmness with which a community treats certain moves as non-negotiable. Logic is a human activity, not a picture of divine order. Out of this comes Wittgenstein's distinctive view of certainty. When he writes on certainty, he argues that our most fundamental commitments are not pieces of knowledge, they are the ground on which knowledge stands. We don't verify that there's an external world or that the earth has existed for years. Those propositions form the background that makes checking and doubting possible. Doubt only makes sense inside a framework of trust. These basic commitments, he calls them hinges, are not justified by reason or evidence, they are what reason and evidence depend on. So when philosophers demand ultimate justification, they're asking for something that by definition can't exist. The game of giving reasons ends somewhere.
The same therapeutic attitude appears when he discusses science and mathematics. Mathematical certainty, he says, isn't a discovery of eternal truths, but a reflection of how rigidly we use certain language games. A proof doesn't reveal a pre-existing object. It trains us to treat an equation as settled. Mathematical necessity is grammatical necessity. This doesn't make math arbitrary. It shows its authority comes from our forms of life, not from a separate realm of abstract entities. What all of this amounts to is a complete reversal of how philosophy normally approaches problems. Traditional philosophy tries to build theories about knowledge, mind, reality, or ethics. Wittgenstein's method is to dissolve those problems by looking at how the language that creates them actually functions. When a philosopher asks, "How do words refer to objects?" the impulse is to invent a mechanism of reference. Wittgenstein's answer is, look at the ordinary cases where reference happens, and you'll see there's nothing mysterious, just countless ordinary uses that work because people agree on them. The temptation to theorize disappears once you attend to the facts of language use. The effect is both liberating and unsettling. It means philosophy cannot provide final explanations. It can only describe and clarify. The aim is not knowledge, but understanding. To see how language works is to be released from the need for metaphysical pictures. The payoff is clarity, not discovery. For Wittgenstein, clarity is enough. It's what ends confusion and lets us live without illusion. Language is not a mirror of the world. That's the realization that cracks Wittgenstein's early system. When he looked closely at how people actually talk, he saw that words don't simply represent things, they function in countless different ways. The meaning of a word isn't something hidden behind it. It's visible in how the word is used within life. Once you see that, the picture theory looks too narrow, like a rigid skeleton that can't bend to the way language really moves. In the philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein completely reverses direction. Instead of asking what structure all meaningful sentences share, he asks how words work in the stream of life. Language isn't one monolithic thing. It's a collection of what he calls language games. Each game has its own rules, its own purpose, and its own rhythm. Think about giving orders, telling jokes, asking questions, describing an image, or saying a prayer. All of these are language games, and none of them obeys the same logic. There's no single essence of language. There are only patterns of use. This is what he means when he says the meaning of a word is its use in the language. Words don't carry their meanings like labels stuck to objects. Meaning is not an invisible property. It's the way the word works in practice. When you understand a word, you've learned how to use it correctly in a community. There's nothing hidden behind that use. There's no inner object that gives it force. You know what game means because you can take part in activities we call games, not because you grasp a definition that covers all of them. That idea connects directly to another central notion, family resemblance. When you try to define what all games have in common, you'll fail. Some involve competition, others don't. Some have winners, others don't. But they overlap, like the similarities between members of a family. No single feature runs through all of them, yet the resemblance is real. That's how concepts work in general. We don't grasp them through fixed definitions, but through flexible patterns of overlap and practice. This insight kills the old philosophical obsession with essences. For centuries, philosophy tried to find what truth, beauty, or mind really are, some ultimate feature hidden behind the variety of cases. Wittgenstein says that's a misunderstanding of how language operates. We use those words in specific ways, and each use forms part of the concept's life. There's no secret thing that gives them meaning. Philosophers get confused because they take words out of their natural environment and force them into theoretical ones. When Wittgenstein says that philosophy's job is to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle, this is what he means. The fly bottle is our tangled misunderstanding of our own language. We keep bumping into the glass, trying to find the essence of meaning or the nature of reality. But the way out is simply to look at how we actually speak and live. Clarity comes not from discovering hidden truths, but from describing the grammar of our ordinary practices. Grammar, for Wittgenstein, doesn't mean syntax or school rules. It means the rules that make words work. To understand a concept is to understand its grammar, the moves you can and can't make with it. For example, you can meaningfully ask, "What time is it?" but not, "What color is time?" because that breaks the grammar of the word. It's nonsense, not because it violates logic, but because it doesn't belong to any language game we play. Philosophical confusion often comes from this kind of grammatical mistake, from misusing words outside the games where they make sense.
By shifting philosophy's task from building theories to describing use, Wittgenstein dissolves many old puzzles. The problem of meaning, the mind-body problem, the question of universals, all start to look like illusions created by our misuse of language. His method is therapeutic, not explanatory. He doesn't want to explain how language really works. He wants to show how our misunderstandings arise, so we can let them go. The goal is peace, not discovery. The shift from the Tractatus to the Investigations is one of the most radical turns in modern philosophy. Early Wittgenstein thought meaning was fixed by logical form. Later Wittgenstein saw it as woven into human activity. In the early view, philosophy drew boundaries around sense. In the later view, it mapped the shifting terrain of use. Both phases aimed at clarity, but the second understood that clarity comes from participation, not abstraction. Philosophy isn't above ordinary life, it's within it. The idea of rule following sounds simple until you try to explain what it really means to follow a rule. Wittgenstein pushes this question until it breaks open a deep problem. If every action can be made to fit a rule, then what does it mean to actually follow one
rather than just behave in a way that can be interpreted as such. When you learn to add numbers, you're taught examples. 2 plus 2 equals 4, 3 plus 3 equals 6, and so on. After enough practice, you go on to new cases confidently. But suppose someone suddenly writes 1,000 plus 1 equals 1,002. You'd say they're doing it wrong. Yet from their point of view, maybe they're just applying a different rule that so far happened to match the examples they were shown. What determines the correct continuation? Not an inner picture of a rule in the head, because that picture itself can be interpreted in different ways. What fixes the meaning of plus is how the community uses it, how people are trained to respond, how they agree in practice. This is the rule-following paradox. No mental state or private act can by itself guarantee that you're following a rule correctly. If every step requires another rule to interpret it, you'd fall into an infinite regress. The stopping point isn't a further rule, but our shared form of life, the pattern of human agreement in behavior, in reactions, in judgments. This is simply what we do. That sounds unsatisfying to philosophers who want foundations, but Wittgenstein thinks it's the only place the chain can end. Certainty isn't built on logic, it's built on practice. This insight leads straight to the private language argument. Suppose someone tried to invent a language to describe their purely inner experiences, sensations no one else could see or test. They decide that each time they feel a certain pain, they'll write S. They think they've created a private reference, a word whose meaning only they know. Wittgenstein says this can't work. For a sign to have meaning, there must be criteria for correct and incorrect use. In a private case, there are no such criteria. Whatever the person feels will seem right. And if anything seems right, the distinction between right and wrong collapses, and with it, the concept of meaning. So a truly private language is impossible. This doesn't mean we can't talk about inner life. It means our talk about sensations depends on public training. We learn words like pain not by pointing to a private object, but by being taught how and when to use them. A child learns pain through cries, comfort, and context, not by identifying a mental substance. The word's meaning lives in those social interactions. So when we speak of thoughts, emotions, or intentions, we're not reporting hidden entities, but participating in shared human practices. This shift turns the whole picture of the self inside out. Instead of being a private container of experiences, the mind is a pattern of abilities, reactions, and shared language. Understanding someone isn't a matter of reading their inner state, but of responding correctly within the same practice. To know what believe, hope, or intend means is to know how those words are used in the flow of life. This point, Wittgenstein's method becomes fully therapeutic. Traditional philosophy tries to explain how inner and outer connect, how mind relates to body, how thought relates to language. Wittgenstein shows that the question itself is a confusion born from mixing different language games. We imagine thought and speech as two independent domains that need a bridge, but they're already intertwined in our practices. The bridge problem dissolves once you stop forcing them apart.
This also changes what it means to understand a rule, a word, or even another person. Understanding isn't a mental event, but a skill. It's the ability to participate correctly in a practice. When you say you understand the word chair, you're not referring to an image stored in memory. You're showing that you can use the word in normal ways. You can answer questions about chairs, point to one, build one, or sit on one. The proof of understanding is in the activity, not in an introspective state. Wittgenstein's constant refrain is, don't look for meaning behind the practice, look at the practice itself. That's where philosophy must do its work. Describe, don't theorize. The job is to untangle the knots created when we misuse our own language, when we drag words out of the games that give them life and treat them as names for mysterious entities. Once you see that, the need for metaphysical explanation fades away. You're left with a clear view of how human life with language actually operates. Wittgenstein's treatment of the mind continues naturally from the rule-following problem. Once you see that words about sensation and thought get their meaning from shared use, the picture of the mind as a hidden stage collapses. What people call inner life is not a private region, but part of the way we live together and speak. When someone says, "I'm thinking," it sounds like a report about an internal process, but look at how the expression is actually used. Sometimes it means, "Give me a moment." Sometimes, "Don't interrupt." Sometimes it just marks hesitation. There's no single, invisible event it names. Language about mental life is woven into behavior. That doesn't mean there are no experiences. It means experiences by themselves don't give words their sense. The grammar of believe, imagine, want, and feel comes from how we talk, not from what hides inside. This dissolves a whole tradition of philosophy that pictured thought as a movie running behind the eyes. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." Wittgenstein would answer, "The use of I think is what gives the expression its role." The certainty of self-consciousness is not a private fact, but a grammatical feature of language. You can't doubt that you are in pain in the same way you can doubt that someone else is, because the grammar of pain allows first-person use as expression and third-person use as observation. It's not a matter of deeper access, but of how the word works. When we talk about intentions, the same pattern appears. To intend is not to have a special mental object before the act. It's to act with certain expectations, to give reasons, to take responsibility. You can see the intention in the practice, in how a person continues or corrects their behavior, not in an inner flash. The grammar of intention links it to planning, decision, and accountability. Philosophy goes astray when it tries to locate the intention in some inner state instead of in the network of actions and reactions that show what counts as intending. This approach also redefines understanding. Understanding a sentence, a joke, or a person is not a hidden translation process inside the head. It's the ability to respond appropriately, to go on in the same way others do. We judge understanding through participation. You laugh at the right time. You continue the conversation sensibly. You apply a concept correctly. There's no secret mechanism that guarantees this. It's part of what we learn as members of a community. The temptation to postulate mental mechanisms comes from looking for causes where there are only rules. We think there must be something inside that explains why words mean what they do. Wittgenstein's answer is that nothing further is needed. The use itself is the explanation. The regularities of human life, the training, the corrections, the expectations constitute what we call meaning. Philosophy's mistake is to confuse these normative patterns with causal processes. From here, Wittgenstein's late work turns toward the structure of certainty and logic itself. If rules depend on shared practices, what gives mathematics and logic their necessity? Why does 2 plus 2 have to make 4? He argues that necessity is not a fact about the world, but a reflection of the firmness of our grammatical rules. The propositions of logic and mathematics don't describe reality, they set the framework within which description happens. Saying 2 plus 2 equals 4 is not discovering something, it's expressing one of the rules that define our system of counting. Its certainty comes from the role it plays, not from correspondence with an independent realm. In mathematics and logic, Wittgenstein sees the same misunderstanding that appears in metaphysics. We treat the rules of our own language games as descriptions of an independent, higher reality. Philosophers have often said that logic describes the structure of all possible worlds, or that mathematical truths exist eternally. Wittgenstein turns this around. Logical and mathematical propositions don't depict anything. They are among the rules that make depiction possible. When you say 2 plus 2 equals 4, you're not stating a fact that could be otherwise. You're expressing part of the framework within which counting and calculation make sense. Its certainty comes from the way we use numbers, not from some abstract world of forms. If someone insisted that 2 plus 2 equals 5, We wouldn't check the world to see who's right. We'd say they don't know the rules of arithmetic. The necessity of mathematics is grammatical. It's built into our practice, like the rule that in chess, the king moves one square. The rule isn't true or false. It defines what the game is. That's what Wittgenstein means when he says that mathematical propositions are normative. They tell us how we operate, not what we've discovered. Proofs don't uncover hidden facts. They show how one move in the game follows from others by established procedures. When a community of mathematicians accepts a proof, that acceptance becomes part of the practice. There isn't a mysterious external entity called mathematical truth guaranteeing it. There's agreement in training, teaching, and checking. The solidity of mathematics is human, not cosmic. Logic works the same way. Logical connectives, and, or, not, don't name relations in the world. They mark the grammar of statements. If P then Q isn't about a real causal link, but about the pattern of reasoning we adopt. The so-called laws of logic are reflections of how we use propositions, not observations of a metaphysical order. They set the limits of sense rather than describing objects within it. This doesn't make logic or math arbitrary. The rules are as firm as the life that sustains them. We can imagine changing the color of traffic lights, but we can't easily imagine abandoning arithmetic because our entire way of acting and talking depends on it. The rigidity of certain rules comes from how deeply they are woven into our form of life. That's why Wittgenstein says, it is our acting which lies at the bottom of the language game. Seeing logic and math this way frees us from the illusion that philosophy must ground them in some ultimate reality. There's no deeper foundation under the practices. The practices themselves are the foundation. Asking why we follow these rules is like asking why a game has the rules it does. At some point, explanation ends in the fact that this is how we play. The sense of absolute necessity we feel is a feature of how thoroughly we are trained into those practices. From this point, Wittgenstein's attention shifts again. If the firmness of rules rests on shared human activity, what happens when we reach the very background assumptions that make any practice possible? What lies beneath knowledge itself? That's the question he tackles in his last notes, published as On Certainty. In On Certainty, Wittgenstein looks at the roots of what we call knowing. He was reading Moore's defense of common sense, statements like, "Here is a hand. The earth existed long before my birth." And instead of treating them as proofs, he saw them as clues. What kind of statement is, "Here is a hand"? It's not an ordinary empirical claim, but neither is it nonsense. It sits beneath doubt. It defines the background that makes doubting possible at all. Wittgenstein calls these background certainties hinge propositions. A hinge works because it doesn't move. Doors swing only because the hinge stays fixed. In the same way, inquiry, testing, and justification depend on a framework of beliefs that aren't themselves up for checking every time. The world exists, objects persist, language works. These are not conclusions we arrive at. They're part of the way we operate. This reverses a lot of traditional epistemology. Philosophers since Descartes had tried to find indubitable foundations by doubting everything and building back up. Wittgenstein says that doubt itself presupposes a background of trust. To question whether you have two hands, you already have to be using words, memories, senses, and the world in ways that assume their reliability. Radical skepticism breaks its own conditions of meaning. It saws off the branch it's sitting on. So certainty for Wittgenstein is not a special state of mind or an inner conviction.
It's the set of practices that make meaning possible. I know the earth exists isn't a piece of knowledge. It's part of the framework within which we have knowledge. If someone genuinely doubted it, they wouldn't just be wrong, they'd be outside the shared game of talking about knowing. This also means that knowledge itself is a category within certain contexts. Saying, I know the train leaves at 6 makes sense because it can be checked, confirmed, or corrected. But saying, I know I have a body doesn't work the same way. There's no process of verification. We can call it certain, but that certainty isn't based on evidence. It's the bedrock on which evidence operates. Wittgenstein's move here is to replace the old model of foundations with a model of trust embedded in life. Our beliefs rest not on proof, but on the way our practices hang together. Certainty is like the soil under the building of thought, not another brick in its walls. Trying to justify it is misunderstanding its role.
This insight doesn't end in relativism. The background is human and shared. It's what we are trained into as speakers, workers, learners. Doubt and knowledge both happen within that shared world. The skeptic's fantasy of stepping outside all assumptions is just another confusion created by taking words out of their natural context. When Wittgenstein looks at these hinges, he is again doing therapy, not theory. He isn't giving a new foundation, he's showing that the demand for one is misplaced. Once you see how language and practice already provide stability, the anxiety of philosophy fades. The point isn't to add new knowledge, but to see clearly how knowing itself works. At this late stage, Wittgenstein also reconnects with themes from the Tractatus, the idea that what truly holds life together can't be put into propositions. The sense of absolute certainty we have about the world isn't a hidden insight. It's the quiet background of all our actions. Philosophy doesn't discover it. It learns to stop tripping over it. The next and final major theme ties back to what early Wittgenstein had called the unsayable: ethics and aesthetics. If they aren't matters of fact, where do they live? In the attitude, in the way we look at and live in the world. In both the Tractatus and his later writings, Wittgenstein treats ethics and aesthetics as the edge of what can be said. In the early period, he writes that values cannot be expressed by facts. They make themselves manifest. That line isn't poetic. It's a precise claim about grammar. If language can only picture possible facts, then statements of value cannot picture anything. Murder is wrong isn't a description of a state of affairs like the door is open. There is no arrangement of objects in the world that is the wrongness of murder. Yet value is not meaningless either. It's shown in our attitude toward the world, in how we act and respond. In the Tractatus, this appears as the idea of the ethical. Ethics is not another domain of facts, but the condition of meaningful life. The world of the happy is a different world from that of the unhappy, he says, meaning that ethics and aesthetics are perspectives, ways of seeing the world sub specie aeterni, under the aspect of eternity. What that points to is a transformation in how one lives, not in what one knows. The world itself doesn't change, the attitude does. That's why he can say that ethics cannot be put into words. It shows itself. Later, Wittgenstein keeps that insight, but grounds it in the language game framework. Instead of treating ethics as mystical, he looks at how evaluative language actually functions. Words like good, beautiful, right, or ought don't describe facts. They guide action, express commitment, show approval. Their sense lies in the roles they play in our lives. When you call something beautiful, you're inviting attention,
shaping response, sharing feeling. When you call something good, you're aligning it with a pattern of expectations and practices. There's no hidden property called goodness. There's the grammar of value talk within human life. This doesn't make ethics subjective or arbitrary. It makes it human. The stability of moral language, like that of any other, comes from our shared form of life. We learn when to call something cruel, when to call it kind, by seeing how people use those words, what expectations they expect, what actions follow. Moral education is not discovering moral facts, but learning to participate in the practice. Our form of life supplies the background agreement that makes moral judgments intelligible. Aesthetics works the same way. To call a piece of music beautiful or a line awkward is to engage in a cultural practice with its own standards. Wittgenstein notes that aesthetic judgment often involves demonstration rather than definition. You point, you show, you say, "See this?" or "Listen to that transition." The grammar of beautiful is intertwined with shared training and taste. This is another case of showing rather than saying. What can't be put into general propositions is still lived and shown in how we speak and act. By treating ethics and aesthetics as forms of life rather than theories, Wittgenstein dissolves another philosophical illusion, the search for objective foundations of value. There's no ultimate justification to be found because none is needed. The need for justification arises only within particular language games, and ethical life is one of them. Asking for a further foundation misunderstands how language itself works. From this perspective, the unsayable of the Tractatus and the form of life of the investigations point to the same thing, the background of human activity that gives words their sense, but can't itself be captured by them. It's not mystical in a supernatural sense. It's just what can only be lived, not theorized. That leads to Wittgenstein's final understanding of philosophy itself. He stops treating it as a field that explains and starts seeing it as an activity that clarifies. Philosophy, he says, leaves everything as it is. Its role is not to advance theses, but to describe the workings of our language so that confusions disappear. Once the confusions are gone, nothing new is added, but the view is clear.
Wittgenstein's mature conception of philosophy emerges as a direct response to the errors he believed had plagued the entire Western philosophical tradition. He saw philosophers repeatedly misled by the surface form of language, taking grammatical allusions as deep metaphysical truths. His late work, particularly the Philosophical Investigations, Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics, and On Certainty, may seem fragmentary, but the vision that binds them together is remarkably consistent. Philosophy is not a science and cannot yield theories. Its purpose is therapeutic. It aims to cure the confusions that result when language is taken beyond its natural limits. For Wittgenstein, the central mistake of philosophy lies in mistaking the logic of our language for a kind of hidden structure of reality. Traditional metaphysics, epistemology, and even ethics, in his view, arise when philosophers try to describe what cannot be described, to formulate in propositions what can only be shown in use. Instead of looking at how words actually function in everyday life, philosophers invent idealized forms of language that no one genuinely employs. This process produces pseudo-problems, questions that feel deep but rest upon grammatical misunderstandings. The task of philosophy, then, is to bring words back from their metaphysical to their ordinary use, to show that many philosophical puzzles dissolve once one sees clearly how the relevant expressions operate in our common linguistic practices. He frequently compared philosophy to therapy, and the metaphor is apt. Just as a therapist helps a patient recognize and release the compulsions of thought that cause suffering, the philosopher helps us identify and let go of the mental knots that arise from our misuse of language. In this sense, the philosopher does not construct theories. Rather, he clarifies, reminds, and rearranges. The success of philosophy is not measured by the discovery of truths, but by the disappearance of confusion. When the knots are untied, nothing new has been added, yet everything appears differently. This therapeutic approach also changes the relationship between philosophy and science. Wittgenstein insisted that philosophical problems are not empirical problems. Where the scientist seeks to discover how the world is, the philosopher investigates how our concepts of world, object, cause, knowledge, or meaning function. To conflate these two modes of inquiry is to misunderstand both. The philosopher does not compete with the scientist. He describes the framework within which scientific questions make sense. This distinction preserves philosophy as an autonomous discipline, one without doctrines or results, an activity, not a theory. At the center of this activity is description. Wittgenstein's method relies on detailed attention to the ordinary. He urges us to look, not to think, meaning not to invent explanations, but to observe the actual workings of our linguistic practices. This emphasis on description leads to his famous notion of family resemblance. Philosophical categories such as game, language, knowledge, or mind do not rest on single essential features common to all instances. Rather, their unity arises from overlapping similarities, like threads in a rope. The search for a single defining essence is precisely the kind of misplaced rigor that philosophy must overcome. Language is flexible, adaptive, and social. Its boundaries are not drawn by logic, but by use. This insight extends to all traditional philosophical domains. In epistemology, the craving for certainty dissolves when we see that knowing is not a mental state, but a practice governed by criteria internal to specific contexts. In philosophy of mind, the idea of a private inner realm collapses once we recognize that our concepts of sensation and emotion depend on public criteria of expression. In metaphysics, the notion of a hidden reality beneath appearances fades once we understand that reality itself is a concept woven into our grammar of discourse. Each time, Wittgenstein replaces speculation with attention to the forms of life in which our words acquire sense. This view has profound consequences. It displaces the philosopher from the role of the theorist to that of the observer and critic of language. It also transforms what it means to understand philosophy itself. For Wittgenstein, comprehension is not a matter of accepting a doctrine, but of achieving a certain clarity of vision. The ideal result of philosophy is silence, not because there is nothing to say, but because the impulse to say what cannot be said has been overcome. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, was not a prohibition, but an invitation to see that the limits of language are the limits of what is meaningful.
His influence radiates throughout 20th century thought. Ordinary language philosophy, as developed by figures such as J.L. Austin and Gilbert Ryle, directly inherits his insistence that meaning lies in use and that philosophical puzzles vanish when we analyze everyday speech. In analytic philosophy,
His critique of logical formalism reshaped debates about rule following, meaning, and the nature of mental content. In continental traditions, thinkers such as Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida echoed his insight that language does not simply represent reality, but constructs the space in which reality is understood. Even in cognitive science, Wittgenstein's notion that understanding is rooted in shared human practices anticipates modern embodied and enactive theories of mind. Yet, his influence cannot be confined to academic philosophy. The therapeutic stance he proposed has resonated with anyone seeking clarity amid the chaos of thought. It encourages a kind of intellectual humility, a refusal to claim mastery over meaning. To practice philosophy in Wittgenstein's sense is to live attentively, to speak carefully, to recognize when language ceases to serve understanding and begins to mislead. It is to remember that what matters most, value, love, beauty, the sense of the world, shows itself in how we live, not in what we can state. The impact of Wittgenstein's philosophy is difficult to overstate because he didn't create a doctrine, he created a new attitude toward thinking itself. Instead of giving answers, he changed the questions. That shift continues to ripple through philosophy, psychology, linguistics, AI, and even everyday reasoning. What he left behind wasn't a system to be memorized, but a way of seeing. That confusion doesn't come from ignorance of facts, but from misunderstanding how our own language works. Once that insight lands, every debate looks different. Let's start with philosophy after Wittgenstein. The mid-20th century analytic world was obsessed with logic and analysis, clear propositions, rigorous argument, everything modeled after science. Then, Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations appeared and dismantled that ambition from within. He had been the hero of logical positivism through the Tractatus, but now he was showing that even logic and meaning are rooted in human practice, not pure structure. That split the field. Some philosophers kept chasing formal precision, others, following Wittgenstein, turned to ordinary language. In Britain, thinkers like J.L. Austin, Gilbert Ryle, and P.F. Strawson took his message seriously. They began to study the everyday use of words, how we actually speak, and what that reveals about the mind. Austin's speech act theory, for example, echoes Wittgenstein directly. Austin showed that saying something is often doing something. When you say, "I apologize," you're not describing an inner state, you're performing an act within a rule-governed situation. That's pure Wittgenstein. Meaning is use, and use happens within practices. Ryle's attack on the ghost in the machine, the idea of mind as an inner entity, also builds on the Wittgensteinian view that mental talk is part of our behavior, not a report of hidden events. In continental philosophy, Wittgenstein's influence took a different route. Philosophers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida shared his suspicion of abstract systems. While their methods differed, the resonance is clear. Meaning and understanding emerge from lived contexts, not from detached theory. The Wittgensteinian idea of forms of life parallels Heidegger's view of being in the world. Both reject the picture of humans as neutral observers. Later, Derrida's deconstruction of language can even be seen as an extension of the same insight. Language is not a transparent mirror of reality, but a network of uses and differences. In linguistics, Wittgenstein's fingerprints are everywhere. His idea that language is a social activity anticipates pragmatics, the study of meaning in context. Philosophers of language like John Searle and Paul Grice developed theories of conversation and intention that echo Wittgenstein's focus on use. Grice's cooperative principle, for example, that speakers assume cooperation and shared understanding, fits neatly with Wittgenstein's idea of shared forms of life. Modern linguistics, especially pragmatics and sociolinguistics,
still operates on this principle. You can't understand meaning without looking at interaction. In psychology, his impact shows up in the shift away from mentalism. Behaviorism took some inspiration from his rejection of inner essences, though it misunderstood him by denying the mental altogether. Wittgenstein never said there are no inner experiences. He said that talk about them gains meaning only within certain contexts. You can't look inside your head and find pain. The meaning of pain is in how we react, express, and respond. This insight influenced later cognitive psychology and therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, works by revealing how thoughts are embedded in habits of speech and behavior. That's a Wittgensteinian move. Show the pattern, and the confusion loosens.
Artificial intelligence and computer science also picked up his ideas, often indirectly. When researchers talk about whether a machine can understand language, they are stepping right into Wittgenstein's arena. To understand, for him, is not to compute definitions, but to participate in practices. An AI might process syntax perfectly, but if it lacks a form of life, no social training, no shared reactions, no lived background, then it doesn't understand in the human sense. This is the heart of John Searle's Chinese room argument. Following rules isn't understanding. Wittgenstein predicted this decades earlier with his reflections on rule following. You can always interpret a rule in many ways, but what holds interpretation steady is not logic, it's custom, training, agreement in practice. Machines can mimic that, but the mimicry depends on a human world of meanings to anchor it. That insight goes deeper than AI. It reshapes how we think about knowledge itself. Knowledge isn't a pile of justified propositions. It's a way of being in the world that's already saturated with meaning. When Wittgenstein says that the foundation of certainty is our form of life, he's pointing out that rationality is not a universal algorithm. It's a practice embedded in culture and history. This challenges the idea of purely objective thought. Even science, he'd say, depends on hinges, trust in perception, logic, and communication that are not themselves proven, but lived. So when people say Wittgenstein ended philosophy, they mean he ended the illusion that philosophy discovers hidden truths about reality. He didn't end thinking, he changed its job description. Philosophy becomes a map of our conceptual terrain, not to direct us somewhere else, but to show us where we are. Once you see the map clearly, you stop getting lost in paradoxes. That's why so many later philosophers describe his work as liberating. It doesn't close inquiry, it frees it from confusion. In ethics, his influence is subtle but strong. Modern moral philosophy often struggles between relativism and universalism. Either morals are arbitrary or they're objective truths. Wittgenstein shows a third path. Ethics is grounded in human life itself. The reason murder is wrong has force isn't because it describes a metaphysical fact. It's because we live in practices and emotions that make that sentence meaningful. Our moral language doesn't float above life, it's one of its expressions. Understanding that dissolves the anxiety of justification. We don't need to prove morality from first principles. We need to understand the grammar of moral life. Aesthetics follows the same logic. When people debate whether beauty is subjective or objective, Wittgenstein would say the debate is already misframed. Beautiful is a word used in contexts of teaching, comparison, and shared appreciation. The meaning of beauty is in those interactions, not in a hidden property. So the philosopher's job isn't to define beauty, it's to describe how we talk about it, what we do when we say something is beautiful, how we learn to see, how our taste develops. That's the real understanding of art. not analysis of essence, but seeing the grammar of response. The same clarity can be applied to religion. Wittgenstein wasn't promoting or denying faith. He was showing that religious language is its own language game. To believe in God is not to assert a scientific hypothesis. It's to live within a certain form of life, prayer, hope, ritual, moral outlook. Trying to test God exists as if it were water boils at 100 degrees Celsius misses the function of that phrase. It's not about evidence, but orientation. That's why he said, it's not how things are in the world that is mystical, but that it exists. Religion, like ethics and aesthetics, belongs to what shows itself, but cannot be captured in propositions. And yet, even though he insists philosophy should end in clarity, Wittgenstein's writing doesn't feel like a conclusion. It feels alive, restless, always circling back. That's because philosophy, in his view, isn't something you finish once and for all. It's a task. Each generation, each person has to see through their own linguistic fog. The same illusions come back in new forms. Every time a theory promises to reveal the hidden structure of consciousness, or the absolute basis of morality, or the final explanation of meaning, Wittgenstein's ghost quietly asks, have you looked at how you're using your words? He isn't saying, don't theorize at all. He's saying, know what you're doing when you theorize. If you're building a scientific model, great. Just don't confuse that with uncovering metaphysical truth. If you're analyzing logic, fine. Just remember logic is one of our tools, not the skeleton of the universe. His constant demand is honesty in language. Use words in line with their life. Don't let grammar trick you into metaphysics. That's why reading Wittgenstein feels both frustrating and clarifying. He doesn't give you answers to memorize. He makes you see. Each time you think you've grasped his point, he undercuts it, reminding you that clarity isn't a state, but a practice. His whole philosophy is an ongoing exercise in paying attention to words, to life, to the invisible structure of our habits.
That's also why he's so relevant today. In a world flooded with information, argument, and ideology, Wittgenstein's lesson cuts through. Most of our confusion isn't about data. It's about how we use words. Political, scientific, and moral debates all get trapped by linguistic habits. We argue as if our opponents are describing different facts, when often we're just playing different language games. Seeing that doesn't solve disagreements, but it reveals their real nature. Understanding grammar is the first step to understanding each other. Truth, for Wittgenstein, isn't a mysterious correspondence between words and reality. It's a function of our language games. The traditional idea that a statement is true when it matches the world makes sense only inside a particular game, one where checking, comparing, and verifying are possible. The glasses on the table can be true or false because we can look, see, and agree. But when you move outside that, the grammar of truth changes. Saying mathematics is true or ethics is true doesn't operate like that. There's no external fact to check against. These statements live inside human practices that define what checking even means. That doesn't make truth arbitrary or relative. It means that truth depends on use. You can't detach it from life. A scientific claim, a moral judgment, a joke, a command, they all use language differently. Trying to measure them by one universal standard of truth is confusion. Wittgenstein's point isn't that anything goes. It's that meaning and truth are bound to how language functions in a situation. Once you see that, you stop asking, what is truth, as if it were a hidden essence, and instead ask, how does true work here? This shift destroys the traditional metaphysical obsession with correspondence. It also changes logic. Early in his career, Wittgenstein treated logic as the unchanging structure of the world.
the framework that made sense possible. Later, he saw that logic, too, is a human practice. Logical inference, rule following, and proof are part of our form of life. They don't describe the world, they describe how we operate within it. The necessity of logic isn't metaphysical, it's grammatical. To call something illogical is not to say it violates a cosmic order, but that it breaks our own rules of use. That's a radical reorientation. Logic is no longer the skeleton of reality, but the grammar of our thinking. We can't imagine logic being false because logic defines what true and false mean. This is why Wittgenstein compares it to the rules of a game. You don't verify the rules of chess by looking at the board. The game exists because we follow them. The same goes for logic. When you understand that, you stop treating logic as metaphysical necessity and start seeing it as part of our life form, the way we think and communicate. Communication itself for Wittgenstein depends on shared practices, not inner states. The meaning of what I say doesn't come from some private image in my head that you somehow receive. It comes from our shared use of words. That's why he demolishes the idea of a private language, a language that only one person could understand. If meaning depended solely on inner reference, there'd be no way to check whether you're using words correctly. But in real life, the possibility of misunderstanding is what makes meaning possible. There's a standard, agreement, and practice that lets correction happen. Imagine someone saying they have a private word for a sensation that no one else can ever feel or understand. Wittgenstein says that such a language wouldn't count as language at all. You couldn't have rules, you couldn't distinguish correct from incorrect use, and so the idea of meaning would collapse. Meaning lives in the public world, not in the head. This demolishes centuries of Cartesian philosophy, the idea that mind is a private inner space whose contents we label with words. Wittgenstein shows that the mind is not hidden inside us, it's expressed in our behavior, our language, our reactions. You don't infer that someone is in pain, you see it in their cry, their gesture, their face. This view reshapes the problem of consciousness. Philosophers have long asked, how does the mind represent the world? For Wittgenstein, that question already rests on confusion. Representation isn't something the mind does, it's something we do with language. When you see a red apple, there isn't an inner image matching the apple. You just respond in learned ways: apple, red, ripe. The mental picture is a metaphor we've turned into a theory. Once you untangle that, you stop searching for consciousness in a hidden space. It's not a ghostly phenomenon. It's our ordinary life. This dissolves the traditional mind-body problem. We don't have to wonder how the mental connects to the physical, because the distinction between them is not a fact of nature, but a grammatical division. We talk differently about bodies and thoughts, but both kinds of talk are parts of our language. There's no metaphysical bridge to build. The mind is not a thing behind the body. It's the pattern of behavior and expression that belongs to the form of life we call human.
Wittgenstein's entire approach to philosophy of mind therefore redefines what understanding means. Understanding isn't grasping a hidden mental content, it's participating correctly in practices. If you and I can carry on a conversation, use words properly, and act coherently, then understanding is already there. You don't look for it inside. It's manifested outside. That's why when someone says, "I know what you mean," they aren't reporting a mental inspection. They're showing that they can continue the practice. The same idea applies to emotion. We think of emotions as inner states that cause behavior, but Wittgenstein would say that the behavior is part of what emotion means. Anger isn't an invisible force that leads to shouting. Shouting, tone, posture, reaction, all these are what anger is. The psychological vocabulary doesn't name hidden entities, it names patterns of life. That insight, once you accept it,
cuts through endless confusion about the inner world. There's no ghost to find, only the grammar of our expressions. That's not to say the inner doesn't exist. Wittgenstein acknowledges privacy. The way I feel pain is mine, and you can't literally feel it. But that privacy is not the foundation of meaning. You know what pain means because we've learned together how to use that word. Even though each person's pain is private, the concept is public. That's how communication works. Private experiences, public language. We learn to speak from shared life, not from introspection. From here, you can see why he often insists that philosophy is not about discovering new knowledge, but about describing what we already know but overlook. When we try to explain how we understand language or what meaning really is, we've already started from the wrong place. We're trying to build a theory on top of something that only needs to be described clearly. Philosophy, for Wittgenstein, is like clearing fog from the glass. What's behind the glass doesn't change, you just finally see what's there. That's also why he keeps returning to everyday examples. Games, tools, children learning words, simple sentences like, "Bring me a slab." Those are not simplifications. They are the real data for philosophy. If we can understand how meaning works there, we can understand everything else. Complexity doesn't come from metaphysical depth. It comes from how rich our practices are. Once you see that, all the old philosophical obsessions, realism, idealism, skepticism, dualism, look like grammatical confusions. They're not discoveries, they're misuses of language. Wittgenstein's way of thinking changes how we read all philosophy before him. He doesn't refute Plato, Descartes, or Kant directly. He makes their problems evaporate. Descartes asks how we can know the external world exists. Wittgenstein replies, to doubt it, you already presuppose it. Kant wonders about the conditions of experience. Wittgenstein answers, the conditions are our form of life and the grammar of our language. Plato looks for the essence of concepts. Wittgenstein shows that there is no hidden essence, only overlapping uses that form a family resemblance. The same move works again and again. You don't fight old metaphysics, you wake up from it. That's what makes Wittgenstein's philosophy both simple and extremely hard. It's simple because it tells you to look, not theorize. It's hard because the urge to theorize is built into us. We want hidden meanings, deeper explanations, ultimate truths. Wittgenstein's therapy asks us to stop and notice that the surface is enough. The world we live in, the words we use, the games we play, that's where meaning is. Nothing is hidden. The difficulty is believing that nothing is hidden. When he says philosophy leaves everything as it is, he doesn't mean we shouldn't change the world ethically or politically. He means that philosophical understanding doesn't alter the facts, it clarifies how we see them. Once you stop being confused by words, your thinking becomes sharper, cleaner, and more humane. The point isn't to build a perfect theory, but to live without illusion. In physics, it becomes a parameter in equations. The confusion arises when we take a technical use and read it back into ordinary life, asking questions that don't fit either context. For Wittgenstein, this kind of category error is where philosophy goes wrong, when it mistakes a shift in grammar for a discovery about the world. Another example is consciousness. Scientists and philosophers debate whether machines can be conscious or how the brain produces consciousness. Wittgenstein would say that the word consciousness is not the name of a thing, but part of how we talk about experience. We use it when distinguishing between being awake and asleep, aware and unaware, intentional and accidental. It's a word that coordinates our practices, not a label for a mysterious inner object. So when we ask how consciousness emerges, we're already misusing grammar.
treating a word for human life as if it referred to a physical process. The question looks deep, but is confused. Once you untangle that, you don't lose consciousness, you just stop mystifying it.
This linguistic lens applies to almost every philosophical topic: ethics, religion, aesthetics, and even logic itself. Wittgenstein's later work shows that logic is not the hidden skeleton of the world, but a rule of description within our language. Logic is grammar made explicit. When we say something is logical or illogical, we're not invoking cosmic order, but describing conformity or violation within a system of rules. The strength of logic comes from its role in our life, not from metaphysical necessity, but from how humans agree in their reasoning. That's why logic, mathematics, and language are inseparable from our form of life. Without that background of agreement, symbols would be dead marks. His reflections on religion illustrate this perfectly. Wittgenstein never attacked religion as superstition. He treated it as a distinct language game. When someone prays or says they have faith, they're not making empirical claims about the world. They're participating in a form of life with its own grammar. To ask whether God exists in the same way a planet exists is to confuse categories. Faith is not an alternative hypothesis, it's a way of living. Understanding this doesn't mean approving or disapproving, it means seeing clearly what's going on. A religious statement, for Wittgenstein, expresses a commitment, not a prediction. It belongs to the realm of meaning, not measurement. This move, seeing language games as self-contained yet interconnected, gives us a powerful tool for understanding human life. It explains why so many debates go in circles. People mix the grammar of one practice with another. Scientists try to speak moral truth using the grammar of evidence. Theologians try to describe faith using the grammar of proof. Politicians try to define values as if they were measurable data. All of these confusions show how deeply Wittgenstein's insight applies. Philosophical clarity begins by restoring words to their home territory. That doesn't mean everything is relative. Our forms of life overlap, and that overlap gives stability to meaning. Humans everywhere point, name, teach, agree, and question. Those shared reactions form the foundation of sense. Even if languages differ, the practical structure of life, learning, correcting, communicating, remains common. Wittgenstein's philosophy is therefore not nihilistic. It doesn't say that meaning is arbitrary, but that meaning is grounded in our shared humanity. The world we live in is not fixed by language, but language is the medium through which the world is humanly grasped. This perspective also explains why his work resists systematization. Every attempt to summarize Wittgenstein as a theory of language or mind contradicts his project. He wanted to end theory, not build one. His remarks are tools, not doctrines. They're meant to be used and then discarded once they've done their work. The value of his writing lies in what it makes you see, not in what it tells you to believe. Reading him is like undergoing a slow change in how you think. The effect is cumulative. You stop being fooled by philosophical puzzles because you begin to notice the grammatical traps before falling into them. That's why his philosophy feels both difficult and liberating. It doesn't give you answers. It gives you freedom from bad questions. You start to sense where language tempts you into confusion when you treat time, truth, or self as things instead of functions in our practices. The shift is subtle but profound. It's like learning to read the grain of language instead of forcing it into abstract patterns. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. In the classroom or online discussions, this approach can transform how people argue. Instead of trying to crush opponents with logic, you start to ask, what game are we even playing? What counts as a move here? Once that becomes clear, arguments often lose their heat. The issue isn't who's right,
but what each side is doing with words. That shift, away from victory toward clarity, is the essence of Wittgenstein's intellectual therapy. Even his remarks on certainty, his final phase, fit this picture. In On Certainty, Wittgenstein explores what it means to know something without doubt. He notices that doubt only makes sense against a background of certainty. You can't doubt everything at once. Some things must stay fixed for questioning to even function. For example, you can't meaningfully doubt that the world exists or that words have meaning, because those assumptions are the bedrock of all questioning. They're not propositions you know, they're the framework of knowing. When someone says, "I know the earth existed before I was born," Wittgenstein points out that this isn't an empirical claim. It's part of the framework we all share. Philosophy that tries to doubt this framework ends up undermining the very language it uses. Clarity means recognizing what stands fast, not because it's provable, but because it's woven into our shared form of life.
In that sense, Wittgenstein's philosophy has a quiet depth that borders on the ethical. To see clearly is to stop forcing the world into unnatural shapes, is to respect the limits of sense. That humility, acknowledging where language ends, is not defeat, it's maturity. The goal isn't to explain everything, but to live intelligently within the space language allows. The moment you stop chasing metaphysical ghosts and start seeing how meaning arises in human life, philosophy returns to its original home, the way we live, speak, and understand one another. Wittgenstein's ideas ripple through every corner of modern thought. In linguistics, his concept of language games paved the way for pragmatic and contextual theories of meaning. Instead of looking for universal grammar in the Chomskyan sense, Wittgenstein's influence led others to look at how meaning shifts depending on use, setting, and purpose. The idea that meaning is fluid, tied to human practices, has shaped everything from discourse analysis to sociolinguistics. Language isn't a static system, it's an activity, something people do, a set of moves in a social game. This same insight also runs through anthropology and cultural studies. The notion of forms of life has become a key way to describe how language and culture are intertwined. To understand a people, you have to understand the practices that give sense to their words. Meaning isn't buried in the head or in a dictionary, it's lived out in habits, rituals, and shared expectations. Anthropologists, influenced by Wittgenstein, began to describe cultures not as systems of hidden meanings, but as networks of practices that make sense internally. Understanding is participation, not translation. In psychology, the shift away from mentalism owes something to Wittgenstein's attack on private language. His argument showed that language can't be purely internal because meaning depends on public criteria. You can't have a language that only you understand, since words get their sense from shared use. This undermined the idea that thoughts are private objects we somehow name internally. Instead, our inner life is expressed outwardly in behavior, gesture, tone, and reaction. Modern behaviorism and later cognitive psychology both carry echoes of this insight, even if they interpret it differently. The point is that the mind isn't a hidden theater, it's a pattern of engagement in the world. In philosophy of mind and AI, Wittgenstein's influence is even clearer. His idea that understanding is not just following rules, but participating in practices anticipates modern debates about artificial intelligence. When a computer processes language, is it really understanding or just simulating understanding? Wittgenstein would likely say it's the latter. A program can follow syntactic rules, but meaning comes from use within a form of life, a shared human practice. Machines don't live in our world of agreements, emotions, and corrections. They can reproduce patterns, but they don't grasp the context that makes those patterns meaningful. That's not a matter of lacking intelligence, it's about lacking life. Meaning is not computation, it's participation.
The same principle applies to moral and political discourse. Many ideological battles are disguised grammatical confusions. When people argue about justice, freedom, or rights, they often assume those words refer to single fixed entities. Wittgenstein would urge us to look at how those words actually function in conversation. They carry overlapping but not identical uses: ethical, legal, emotional, historical. Trying to define them once and for all is like trying to define game. There's no single essence, only a family of similarities. Recognizing this doesn't make values meaningless, it makes them clearer. We stop pretending that one definition will end disagreement and start seeing that disagreement is part of the language game itself. Education and pedagogy have also absorbed Wittgensteinian aims. Teaching isn't about transmitting definitions, but initiating someone into practices. Learning a language is learning to take part in a form of life, to react, infer, and improvise. That's why Wittgenstein described understanding as a kind of skill. You don't learn meaning by memorizing propositions, you learn it by doing. Every teacher knows that a student truly grasps a concept not when they can repeat it, but when they can use it correctly in context. That's Wittgenstein's insight in action. In literature and art, Wittgenstein's impact is subtler but powerful. His distinction between saying and showing influenced entire movements in aesthetics and theory. Artists took from him the idea that not everything meaningful can be stated. The structure of a painting, a melody, or a poem can express something that can't be paraphrased. The meaning isn't behind the work, it's in the way the work is experienced within our shared form of life. This idea resonates with modernism and postmodernism alike, both of which explore the limits of expression. The point is not that language fails, but that meaning sometimes exceeds what words can capture.
Even ethics and existential questions shift under Wittgenstein's lens. He doesn't give moral systems or universal principles, but he does show why moral talk matters. Ethics, for him, isn't about describing facts, but about expressing a stance toward life. When someone says, "You must be kind," they're not stating an empirical truth, they're guiding action within a human form of life. Morality isn't discovered, it's lived. This makes ethics less about theory and more about clarity, seeing what we actually mean when we use moral language. Much moral confusion comes from treating moral sentences as factual reports rather than commitments. Understanding that difference restores depth to ethical discourse without turning it into metaphysics. Wittgenstein's influence even extends into psychotherapy. Modern therapeutic approaches like narrative therapy, existential therapy, and even aspects of CBT echo his view that problems often arise from tangled language. When people suffer from anxiety or guilt, part of the problem is how they talk to themselves. Therapy, like philosophy, can be a form of linguistic clarification. Helping someone reframe their inner dialogue, changing how they describe their situation, changes the experience itself. Wittgenstein's idea that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world becomes deeply practical here. Expanding or clarifying language can expand the world one can inhabit. In a broader sense, Wittgenstein teaches a kind of intellectual humility. He shows that the desire for ultimate explanations often hides confusion. The impulse to say, "this must mean something deeper," is what creates pseudo-problems. Clarity isn't reduction, it's release. To see language as it works is to stop demanding it do what it can't. This humility doesn't make philosophy irrelevant, it makes it honest. It turns philosophy from a hunt for cosmic truths into an effort to stay clear-headed within the human condition. So when people ask what's the point of Wittgenstein, the point is this: he teaches us how to stop being bewitched by our own words. Every philosophical or personal confusion that seems impossible often dissolves when we see how language is misleading us. His method doesn't give answers, but gives tools. He doesn't tell us what to think, but shows how to think better. That's why his work feels both frustrating and liberating. It asks for self-awareness instead of belief. The most valuable takeaway from Wittgenstein's philosophy is that sense-making is a human activity, not a discovery of hidden structures. Our concepts, logic, and meaning all grow out of the ordinary.
To study them is not to escape life, but to look at it more closely. That's the heart of his message. The problems of philosophy are problems of the way we live with words. Solve that, and you haven't escaped the world. You've learned how to inhabit it more clearly. Wittgenstein's legacy challenges not only philosophers, but anyone who tries to think clearly about human understanding. His method is not about knowledge, but vision, seeing how meaning arises through use and how confusion arises through misuse. Once this perspective sinks in, it changes how you interpret almost everything: science, morality, politics, even personal reflection. In science, Wittgenstein helps us see the limits of explanation. The scientist's job is to build models that work within certain rules. The philosopher's job is to clarify what those rules mean. When physicists debate the nature of reality, whether quantum mechanics describes an objective world or just probabilities, Wittgenstein would point out that both sides may be stretching words like describe, real, and probability beyond their normal grammar. He'd ask, in what context do these words make sense? What do we mean by explanation here? By returning those words to their home, the argument becomes clearer. Science, in his view, doesn't need philosophy to justify it. It only needs philosophy to untangle when language leads it astray. The same holds for metaphysical speculation. Questions like, why is there something rather than nothing? Or, what is the meaning of life? Sound profound, but can collapse under Wittgenstein's scrutiny. He would ask, what counts as an answer to those questions? What form of life gives those words sense? Often they don't have a clear home in our grammar. They point to a feeling, not a factual issue. The sense of mystery is real, but it doesn't demand explanation, it demands acknowledgement. That's why Wittgenstein said, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. It's not contempt for mystery, it's respect for its inexpressibility. This respect carries over to art and emotion. Art shows what can't be said, not by revealing secret truths, but by presenting new ways of seeing. When a painting, a film, or a piece of music changes how you experience the world, it's not giving information, it's reshaping perception. Wittgenstein's view helps explain why art can feel philosophically powerful without making any argument. It shows rather than says. The grammar of aesthetic experience isn't propositional, it's lived. That's why his early idea of showing survives even in his later philosophy. What can't be stated directly can still be displayed in life.
Wittgenstein's insights also reshape how we think about communication in the modern world. Online, language is fragmented, stripped of tone, gesture, and shared context, the very things that give meaning stability. Misunderstanding flourishes because forms of life clash without recognition. His reminder that meaning depends on use becomes a practical guide to online discourse. Before reacting, ask what game is being played. Is this irony, sincerity, anger, humor, or posturing? The rules differ. Clarity starts with identifying the game. Wittgenstein wouldn't fix social media, but he'd help us navigate it with sanity. His view of philosophy as therapy has even more personal applications. Whenever someone gets stuck obsessing over identity, purpose, or the real self, Wittgenstein's method provides a kind of release. Instead of asking, "Who am I really?" he'd ask, "How do we use the word I?" The answer lies in how we talk about ourselves in practice, in responsibility, intention, and feeling. The confusion comes from treating the self as an object to be found, rather than a role we play in countless language games. Once you see that, the obsession with discovering your true self softens. You realize that self-knowledge isn't excavation, it's clarity about how you speak and act. The therapeutic angle of his philosophy also reshapes what it means to be wise. Wisdom for Wittgenstein isn't the possession of truths, but the ability to stop running into walls made of language. A wise person sees when a question is malformed, when a concept has slipped from one use into another. That kind of sensitivity, Knowing when to speak and when to stay silent is intellectual humility in action. It's why Wittgenstein said that philosophy should make thoughts clear, not clever. Even the ethical tone of his writing reflects this humility. He rarely moralizes, but his demand for clarity carries moral weight. Misuse of language is not just an intellectual mistake, it's a kind of dishonesty. It creates illusion, manipulates thought, and confuses understanding. In politics, this is everywhere. Slogans that sound meaningful but dissolve when analyzed. Arguments that hide confusion behind emotional language. Wittgenstein's discipline of clarity is an antidote to manipulation. It teaches that every honest discussion begins with cleaning up the words. This returns us to his earliest insight. The limits of language are the limits of our world. It doesn't mean reality stops where words stop. It means our sense of the world, our ability to discuss, share, and reason about it, is bounded by how language functions. Expanding understanding is expanding use, not discovering metaphysical facts. We grow our world by growing our language games, by learning new forms of life, engaging with other perspectives, and enriching the practices that give sense to our words. That's why Wittgenstein's philosophy, though it rejects theory, still has a revolutionary core. It makes understanding a living process. Ultimately, Wittgenstein's project turns philosophy inside out. He doesn't give doctrines to follow, but shows a way of working. The philosopher is not a prophet or scientist, but a kind of craftsman of clarity. The tool is language. The goal is peace of mind. Once you grasp how words create the appearance of depth where none exists, you stop being tormented by pseudo-problems. Philosophy becomes not an endless chase for answers, but a continual practice of untangling. This is why his influence endures, because confusion endures. As long as humans speak, we'll need someone to remind us how to use words without getting lost in them. Wittgenstein's philosophy doesn't offer final knowledge. It offers freedom. The freedom that comes from seeing clearly, from being able to live and think without illusions built by our own grammar. His method doesn't solve life's mysteries. It shows how to live well among them. The work of philosophy for him is not to escape confusion once and for all, but to keep language honest, and in doing so, keep ourselves honest too. To take Wittgenstein's ideas even further, it's important to recognize how they change what philosophy itself is supposed to do. He wanted to end the idea that philosophy discovers truths like science does. For him, philosophy doesn't compete with science. It clears the ground for it. The job is not to add new information, but to see the framework in which information makes sense. He once said that philosophy leaves everything as it is. That means it doesn't change the facts of the world. It changes how we see and talk about them. This may sound modest, but it's radical. It turns philosophy from a system-building activity into a therapeutic one. Instead of creating theories, it treats confusion like an illness that needs language therapy, not more data.
If you think about it, this view also reshapes how we think about knowledge in general. Most people assume knowing something means having a correct picture of reality in your mind. Wittgenstein's later philosophy cuts through that assumption. Knowing how to do something, like drive a car or use a word, doesn't depend on holding a mental picture. It depends on acting correctly within a rule-governed practice. Understanding doesn't live in the head. It lives in what we do. This is what philosophers later called knowing how versus knowing that. Wittgenstein blurred that line decades before it became popular. When you use a word properly, you're showing you understand it. There's no inner state that makes it true. You're just playing the game correctly. This same logic undermines a lot of traditional philosophy of mind. Take the idea of mental representation, the belief that we think by manipulating symbols in our head. Wittgenstein would say that's another misplaced analogy. The only reason we think of thoughts as inner pictures is because we confuse the outer language we use for the inner one we imagine. But when you really analyze how we talk about thinking, the picture falls apart. We don't look inside ourselves and find thoughts like objects. We infer them from what we say, do, and react to. Thinking, then, is a process visible in our engagement with the world. This insight is what later philosophers and cognitive scientists used to argue that intelligence isn't just in the brain. It's in our interaction with our environment. Another of Wittgenstein's most powerful ideas is that rules themselves don't determine their own application. No rule tells you exactly how to follow it in every possible case. There's always room for interpretation, and what counts as following a rule is fixed by how a community enforces it, not by any hidden logic. That means meaning is social, not private. Understanding isn't just being able to recite a rule, it's knowing how to continue the practice in a way others will recognize as correct. This simple point explodes the myth that logic or mathematics have meaning independent of human agreement. Even logic lives in use. When we say 2 plus 2 equals 4, that's not a discovery about numbers in heaven. It's a convention of how our form of life counts and adds. The certainty of math doesn't come from a supernatural source. It comes from the stability of our practices. Wittgenstein also dismantled the dream of a perfect logical language. Early in his career, in the Tractatus, he thought the world could be represented by propositions that mirrored facts, a kind of logical picture of reality. But later he realized that was just another illusion. Language doesn't have one single logical structure. There are countless overlapping ways we use words: joking, ordering, promising, describing, praying, guessing. To force them all into one logical model is to miss what language actually is: a living activity. The philosopher's mistake is trying to fit that messy diversity into one clean system. Wittgenstein's later philosophy embraces the mess. It says, stop looking for the underlying essence. Look at the surface, at what people actually do. That shift from depth to surface is one of his greatest contributions. In most philosophy, people assume truth hides beneath appearances. Wittgenstein flips that. He says, no, everything you need to understand is right here in how we use language. There's no hidden layer where meaning lives. There's just use. This runs completely against centuries of Western thought that tried to dig under the surface to find the real meaning, the real essence, the real form. For Wittgenstein, the real is right in front of you. You just misunderstand how it works. That's why his message feels almost like Zen philosophy without the mysticism. It's about stopping the chase for deeper explanations and learning to see clearly what's already there. Even though he rejected metaphysics, Wittgenstein still changed how metaphysical problems are handled. Instead of debating whether universals exist or whether free will is real, he'd ask, what do these words mean in our practices? When do we say something is free or determined? Once you look at that, the big philosophical puzzle often dissolves. We stop asking, is freedom real? And start asking, how do we use the word free in ordinary contexts? The answer is that it has different uses, sometimes moral, sometimes psychological, sometimes legal. There's no single essence of freedom, and trying to find one creates confusion. This is Wittgenstein's great weapon: clarification through context. What makes all this so powerful is that it applies everywhere. You can take Wittgenstein's lens and use it to analyze almost any problem involving meaning: AI, religion, politics, art.
even everyday relationships. Whenever misunderstanding happens, it's usually because the people involved are using the same words but playing different language games. One person's truth might mean scientific accuracy, another might mean personal authenticity. Without noticing the difference, they argue forever about something they don't even agree how to describe. Wittgenstein helps cut through that by showing how our linguistic habits generate confusion.
Wittgenstein's work leaves you with a completely new sense of what it means to understand something. It's not having the right theory, it's being able to see how things fit together in practice. Philosophy, in his view, isn't about producing results. It's about restoring order to thought. And when that order is restored, what remains isn't emptiness, it's peace. You stop being haunted by meaningless questions. You stop mistaking grammatical illusions for mysteries. You start to see language as a set of tools, not traps. That's Wittgenstein's gift. Not knowledge, but clarity that sets the mind free to think again. One of the most fascinating extensions of Wittgenstein's thought comes from how it reshapes our idea of reality itself. In everyday language, we treat reality as something fixed and objective, something out there waiting to be described correctly. But Wittgenstein turns that inside out. For him, what we call reality is already woven into our practices and language games. Our words don't just describe the world, they help create the framework in which the world becomes intelligible to us. This doesn't mean the world is imaginary. It means that the sense of the world, the way it appears as meaningful, depends on our linguistic and practical activities. The rocks, trees, and physical facts are there, but their significance, what we count as true or false, relevant or irrelevant, depends on the form of life we belong to. This is why Wittgenstein's philosophy resists being called either realism or idealism. He sidesteps both. Realists think reality exists independently from us. Idealists think reality depends on our mind. Wittgenstein says that's the wrong question. The relationship between language and world isn't one of dependence or independence, it's one of fit. The way language works is already part of our life. There's no neutral standpoint from which to separate words from the world. The grammar of our statements doesn't float above existence. It's one of the ways we live within existence. Trying to imagine a language completely detached from any form of life is like trying to imagine chess without pieces, rules, or players. It's meaningless. The game is the structure is the meaning. This insight also changes how we think about truth. Philosophers often treat truth as correspondence. Our statements are true if they match reality. Wittgenstein doesn't deny that, but he changes how we understand the match. To say a statement corresponds to reality is just another rule of a particular language game. In science, we check correspondence through experiment. In law, we check it through evidence and testimony. In friendship, we check it through trust and behavior. The idea of truth isn't one thing that stands behind all these. It's a pattern across different human practices. There's no single essence called truth. There are ways we verify and justify depending on context. That's why Wittgenstein said, "It is not agreement in opinions that makes a community, but agreement in form of life." Truth works because our practices work. Another big shift that Wittgenstein forces is about explanation. We're trained to think that explaining something means reducing it to something more basic. Explaining the mind in terms of the brain, explaining society in terms of individuals, explaining language in terms of symbols. Wittgenstein thought this kind of reduction often misses the point. To explain language, You don't need to look for a hidden mechanism, you need to look at how people actually use it. Explanations are useful when they clarify, not when they replace one confusion with another. He warns against the temptation to keep digging for deeper explanations when the surface is what matters. If you already understand how a hammer is used, asking for the essence of hammering is pointless. Philosophy goes wrong when it mistakes practical understanding for something mysterious. That's the core of what makes Wittgenstein so modern. He treats understanding as something public, embodied, and learned, not private or mystical. This has massive implications for psychology, AI, and social theory. When we say a person understands language, what we mean is that they can use it appropriately in context. They can play the right move in the right situation. Machines can process syntax, but understanding involves participating in a shared life of meaning, something machines don't have. Wittgenstein's point isn't that machines can't ever be intelligent. It's that intelligence isn't just about processing. It's about belonging to a world of shared norms. A machine might mimic speech, but it doesn't live in a community that gives words their weight.
This view connects to one of the most profound aspects of Wittgenstein's later philosophy, his emphasis on the ordinary. Philosophers have always wanted to go beyond ordinary life to find ultimate foundations. Wittgenstein says the opposite. Stay within the ordinary because that's where meaning lives. We don't need to look for a foundation under our practices. The practices themselves are the foundation. This is why he often sounds dismissive when people ask metaphysical questions. When someone says, "But how do we know the external world exists?" Wittgenstein might reply, "What does it mean to doubt that?" Our concept of doubt already presupposes a background of certainty, what he called hinge propositions. We don't doubt everything at once because doubt only makes sense against a stable background. These hinge certainties, like there is an external world, people have minds, words have meanings, aren't empirical truths but conditions of sense. They're the ground that makes the game of knowledge possible. This connects to his later work, On Certainty, written near the end of his life. There, Wittgenstein examines how knowledge and doubt actually function. He argues that not everything we claim to know can be justified by evidence, because at some point, the process of justification stops. We don't justify the ground, we act from it. That's why radical skepticism, the idea that maybe we're dreaming or maybe the world doesn't exist, fails not because it's logically impossible, but because it doesn't fit how language works. The sentence, "I doubt the existence of the world," doesn't play any real role in our life. It's a piece of language detached from the form of life that gives it meaning. This is Wittgenstein's quiet realism. The world is not something we prove, it's something we live in. That same realism explains why he thought philosophy should be descriptive, not explanatory. The task isn't to construct theories, but to describe how language functions. Description sounds boring, but for Wittgenstein, it's revolutionary because description restores contact with reality as we actually experience it. The philosopher who insists on explaining language from outside ends up trapped in abstraction. The philosopher who describes how it's used breaks the spell of confusion. This is what Wittgenstein means when he says philosophy should bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use. Once words return home, they stop haunting us. What makes Wittgenstein so endlessly relevant is that this way of thinking can be applied to almost any problem. In religion, it helps us see that faith isn't about propositions, but about practices. When someone says they believe in God, Wittgenstein would ask what kind of statement that is. Is it a hypothesis, a declaration, or a way of living? For him, religious language is its own form of life. It operates under different rules than science or logic. Trying to judge faith by the standards of empirical truth is a category mistake. The same logic applies to art, ethics, and politics. Each has its own grammar of meaning, and confusion arises when we mix them up. In the end, Wittgenstein's philosophy doesn't leave you with doctrines to memorize. It leaves you with a new way of looking at thinking itself. He replaces the search for ultimate truths with the skill of untangling confusion.
He shows that most of what we call philosophical depth is really grammatical confusion dressed up as insight. But this doesn't make life shallow, it makes it clearer. The depth of life is not hidden beneath words, it's in the way words let us live, act, and connect. Wittgenstein's ultimate lesson is that once we understand how language works, we don't just solve philosophical problems, we dissolve them. And what's left is the ability to see, live, and speak without illusion. Another major aspect of Wittgenstein's philosophy is how it transforms our understanding of logic in mathematics. In the early part of his career, he believed that logic revealed the structure of reality, that the world could be represented through propositions that mapped facts. But later he realized logic isn't a mirror of the world, it's a human tool. Logical necessity doesn't come from the world forcing it, it comes from how we use symbols within specific practices. Logic looks absolute because our linguistic practices are so stable and rule-bound. We don't discover logical truths, we establish them through conventions that hold their power by our consistent use. Think about the statement 2 plus 2 equals 4. It feels self-evidently true, but Wittgenstein's view is that it's true because of how we define and use mathematical symbols. It's not that reality guarantees this truth, it's that the rule of addition defines it. The meaning of 2 plus 2 equals 4 comes from how we use the numbers, not from their hidden metaphysical essence. This is why Wittgenstein said mathematics is a system of grammar, not a description of the world. It's a set of rules that structure certain kinds of activity. The mistake is thinking that mathematics describes some ultimate reality. For him, mathematics doesn't describe, it operates. It gives us methods, not mirrors. This way of looking at logic and math shakes up centuries of philosophical tradition. Philosophers from Plato to Frege treated logic and mathematics as uncovering timeless truths that exist independently of us. Wittgenstein cuts that idea down. He says their necessity doesn't lie in metaphysical reality, but in our agreement in using them. They're human achievements. Stable, yes, but human. This doesn't make them arbitrary, it makes them practical. Just like the rules of chess are not arbitrary once you agree to play, the rules of logic are not arbitrary once you use language. Logic is part of the grammar of our world, not the foundation beneath it. This realization also helps explain why Wittgenstein thought so many philosophical problems are illusions. When philosophers ask, what is the nature of necessity, or how can we know logical truths, they're often trying to explain what doesn't need explaining. Necessity doesn't describe how the world works, it describes how our language works. When we say something must be true, we're talking about a rule of grammar, not a fact of nature. This shifts philosophy from metaphysical investigation to conceptual analysis. The philosopher's job is not to uncover hidden causes, but to clarify how words like must, can, and know function in our language. The same kind of analysis applies to meaning itself. Wittgenstein's famous idea that the meaning of a word is its use in the language is simple but revolutionary. It overturns centuries of thinking that words get meaning by representing objects or ideas. Instead, meaning is determined by how we use words in context, how they fit into activities, reactions, and expectations. Words don't carry meaning like containers. They gain it through participation in social life. This makes meaning dynamic, flexible, and grounded in practice. It also means that misunderstanding isn't about having the wrong picture. It's about playing a different game without realizing it. This view demolishes the traditional quest for definitions. Philosophers have always wanted to define things like knowledge, truth, beauty, or justice. Wittgenstein says that project is doomed because these words don't have one essence. They have a family resemblance. Think about the word game. Try to define it. Some games have competition, some don't. Some have roles, some are freeform. What unites them isn't a single feature, but overlapping similarities. The same goes for moral and aesthetic concepts. We don't need a universal definition to use them meaningfully. We navigate them through shared understanding, not fixed boundaries. This insight frees philosophy from chasing impossible definitions. The private language argument is another cornerstone of Wittgenstein's later thought. He asks, can there be a language that only one person could understand, referring to private sensations no one else can access? His answer is no. Language needs public criteria for correctness. If you say you have a private word for a particular sensation, how do you know you're using it correctly? Without external standards, shared practices, you have no way to distinguish between using the word correctly and thinking you're using it correctly. Meaning depends on the possibility of public verification. This argument has enormous implications. It undercuts the idea that mental life is a private theater only you can access. Our talk about the mind, about pain, thought, intention, is grounded in shared human behavior. Our inner life is expressed, not hidden. This also transforms how we think about consciousness. Instead of imagining consciousness as a glowing inner world, Wittgenstein suggests we look at how we use words like know, believe, and feel. Consciousness isn't a thing, it's a way of being in the world, a pattern of expression. When someone says, "I'm in pain," we don't infer it from hidden evidence, we recognize it from their behavior, tone, and context. That's not reductionism, it's realism about human life. The mind is not an object inside us, it's the way we live and respond. This is what later philosophers called the embodied or social view of mind, and it owes everything to Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's thinking also breaks open new ways to see ethics. While he never developed an ethical system, his approach reshapes how moral talk works. Moral language, like religious language, isn't about describing facts. It's about expressing attitudes, commitments, and forms of life. When someone says lying is wrong, they're not stating an objective fact like water boils at 100 degrees. They're expressing a norm that organizes social behavior. Ethics, then, is woven into our life practices, not imposed from the outside. This doesn't make morality arbitrary, it makes it human. Right and wrong have meaning because they play real roles in how we live together. Trying to treat ethics as a science misses what moral language actually does.
Wittgenstein's later philosophy leaves no room for the old dream of philosophy as a quest for absolute foundations. Instead, philosophy becomes a form of intellectual housekeeping, keeping our concepts clear so they don't mislead us. This doesn't sound glamorous, but it's one of the most profound transformations in intellectual history. He didn't solve problems like Descartes or Kant. He showed that most of their problems were built on confused grammar. He didn't build systems, he dismantled illusions. In doing so, he didn't destroy philosophy, he renewed it. He turned it from speculation into therapy, from dogma into clarity. And that's why Wittgenstein's philosophy endures. It's not a set of theories to believe, but a set of tools to use. It's a way to think more honestly, to see more clearly, and to live without getting trapped in confusion disguised as depth. Once you grasp that, philosophy stops being an abstract hobby and becomes a way of keeping thought and life clean. What makes Wittgenstein stand apart from almost every other philosopher is that his ideas aren't meant to be followed like a doctrine. They're meant to be applied like a tool. He doesn't hand you conclusions, he hands you a method for dissolving confusion. Once you see this, his entire project makes sense. Philosophy, for him, isn't about discovering hidden truths, but about learning how to stop getting trapped in bad ways of thinking. He's like a mental mechanic, showing you how to look under the hood of your own language and see what's jamming the gears. The goal isn't knowledge, it's clarity. Once you see clearly, the need for philosophical explanation fades away. This is why Wittgenstein's method feels so different from every traditional philosopher. He doesn't build arguments step by step like a logician. Instead, he shows you examples, thought experiments, bits of dialogue, and reminders. He's not trying to prove a theory. He's trying to awaken you to how language really works. When he says, "Don't think, but look," that's the essence of his method.
Look at how words are actually used in life, not at how philosophers imagine they should be used. Most philosophical problems arise because we take words out of their natural home and put them into a theoretical one where they stop making sense. For example, when people ask, "What is the meaning of life?" Wittgenstein would say that's not a question with an answer. It's a symptom of confusion. The word meaning makes sense in certain language games. The meaning of a word, the meaning of a sentence, the meaning of a gesture. But when we apply it to life, we stretch it beyond its ordinary grammar. Life isn't a sentence waiting to be translated, it's an activity. The desire for a meaning of life is often a desire to escape the limits of our ordinary forms of life. The right response isn't an answer, it's a shift in perspective. Once you stop demanding that life have a meaning in that sense, the anxiety fades and life becomes meaningful in its lived form. Another powerful part of Wittgenstein's philosophy is how it handles the idea of rules and understanding. When we follow a rule, say, how to use a word or how to play a game, there's no private mechanism that ensures we're doing it correctly. What makes an action correct is that it fits within the community's shared practices. Understanding is not something hidden inside your head, it's a form of participation in a public activity. This means that even things we think of as personal, like knowing a language or having an idea, are social to their core. Language is not a private possession, it's a public technique. Meaning, understanding, and rule following all depend on shared forms of life. This also means that communication isn't about transferring mental content from one mind to another. It's about coordinating actions and responses within shared practices. When I say a word and you understand it, it's not because you accessed my inner world. It's because we both know how the word is used. That's why Wittgenstein's philosophy dismantles the illusion of the inner world as a separate realm. The inner and outer are two sides of the same practice. When we talk about what's inside, we're still playing a public language game. That doesn't mean feelings or thoughts aren't real. It means they're expressed through patterns of behavior, speech, and interaction that others can recognize. In this sense, Wittgenstein's work anticipates modern theories of meaning and social interaction. Linguistic pragmatism, social constructivism, and even aspects of cultural anthropology all owe something to his insight that meaning is use. The idea that understanding comes from participation rather than representation has become a foundation for many fields. It explains why people from different cultures or backgrounds can miscommunicate even when using the same words. They're playing different games, guided by different rules. Wittgenstein gives us a way to see through that confusion without reducing it to relativism. He's not saying all meanings are arbitrary. He's saying meaning is always anchored in shared human activity.
He also gives us a new sense of what certainty means. In On Certainty, Wittgenstein points out that every act of reasoning takes place within a background of things we don't doubt. We don't prove that the world exists, that our memories are mostly reliable, or that language works. Those are the hinges upon which doubt turns. Without them, doubt loses sense. This doesn't make certainty dogmatic, it makes it practical. The world's existence isn't something we argue for. It's the condition for argument itself. Once you see this, skepticism stops being threatening. It's not that we defeat skepticism by argument, it's that skepticism dissolves once we see it trying to play a game that doesn't make sense. This understanding of certainty connects to his broader idea of philosophy as therapy. When we're confused, it's often because we're misusing words, trying to make them do jobs they weren't designed for. The philosopher's task is to diagnose that misuse and help the person see the right picture. Once the confusion is cleared up, the problem disappears.
This is why Wittgenstein compared philosophy to therapy. It doesn't add knowledge, it removes disease. The disease is conceptual confusion, and the cure is seeing language clearly. Once you're cured, you don't have answers, you have peace. This view also explains his hostility to theoretical philosophy. He thought that building systems and frameworks always leads back into illusion. Every theory tries to capture what language does naturally, and in doing so, it distorts it. Theorizing about meaning, mind, or reality usually just extends confusion. Instead, Wittgenstein's philosophy is a series of reminders, ways to bring words back to their everyday use. It's like sweeping away dust that accumulates from overthinking. This is why his work feels both deep and simple. He's not offering new facts, but removing the need for them. The clarity he aims for isn't technical precision, it's relief from intellectual anxiety. And that brings us to his most radical claim, that philosophy doesn't produce results. There are no discoveries, no conclusions, no grand theories. The only result of philosophy is the disappearance of confusion. Once you truly understand what he's doing, you realize that's not a limitation, it's a liberation. Philosophy stops pretending to compete with science or religion. It becomes a discipline of mental hygiene, a way to see and live without illusions. The ultimate goal isn't knowledge, it's clarity and peace. As Wittgenstein put it, the real discovery is the one that makes me capable of stopping doing philosophy when I want to.